That's the first person that's ever introduced one of these workshops as having a good time. The area makes it hard, but do appreciate that, Heather. And yes, it's been good to have an association with the church over a long period of time. And there are people here even that I've known off and on for quite some years, isn't there? And I was delighted to stand at the door this morning and shake hands with folks and just see faces and start to remember different times and people. But this is a difficult area, folks, and I would be the first to acknowledge that. And it's an area that's always hard for a church to address. Just acknowledging that it needs to do something actively to keep children safe is an admission that there might be danger in the church. Now, that's not where we want to go, most of us. Most of us like to think of our church as that place where we can at least in one place in the world feel comfortable and at ease and it's safe and a good place. And to think that things might not be for the best at a church is really hard for any of us. So this is always a challenge. And I would say this, that if I touch on material today that you find upsetting or whatever, that you need to do what you need to do so that you are in your best space. And if that means taking a breather, we won't know why people are coming and going. It's been cold weather, hasn't it? And so just take care of yourselves and remember that there's probably not many of us here who haven't been touched in some way or another by this issue, be it in our family, in our own experience or experience of friends or others. It's not something that's unknown, it's just something that we don't talk about. That's probably what I need to say. So I think a word of prayer would be helpful, and then we look at this. Lord, we thank you today for your goodness and grace. And each day we live in the environment of goodness and grace that you provide. We pray this afternoon as we look at a difficult issue, that you may reward our courage and our willingness to confront even those things that are not as easy to examine and think about as other elements. And we pray today this might be an exercise that helps us not only understand, but to be able to implement safe practice that enables the children of this church to grow up knowing and experiencing the kind of safety that reflects your heart. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen. As a young person, my mother was, in fact, a Seventh-day Adventist, and she had become one through a public series of meetings. And I would attend, I was the youngest of 7 siblings, and myself and several of my siblings would visit our mum's church, and we would go along. It's not what I would describe as a safe church. For instance, I would be at my mum's church, would sit in the church service. The pastor up the front would be preaching his sermon, and then we would all wait for it. Sooner or later, someone, somewhere in the congregation would leap to their feet and contradict the pastor and tell him how he ought to be doing it and what he should be saying. And the rest of us would cringe waiting for what might happen next. That didn't feel safe to me. Now, that was about a human interaction, and it was inappropriate interaction. And some of the things that I'm going to talk about today are at a deeper level of non-safety. So I think the best way to do that is to talk about the issues in a cognitive, cerebral thinking way, and then we can perhaps, I'm happy to talk to questions that you might have, but I think this is the best way to get, in a short time, to get an overview, and it's only an overview. We sometimes do workshops over days in this area. So this is a glimpse at what perhaps we could do. And I think I need to give it context. Just imagine a society afflicted by a scourge which has struck down 1/4 of its daughters and up to 1 in 8 of its sons. Now that's a scourge. Imagine also that this plague, while not immediately fatal, lurked in the bodies and the minds of these young children for decades, making them 16 times more likely to experience its disastrous long-term effects. Finally, imagine the nature of these effects: life-threatening starvation, suicide, persistent nightmares, drug and alcohol abuse, and a whole host of intractable psychiatric disorders requiring lifelong treatment. What would the response of society be if that were the case? The scourge that we're speaking of is child sexual abuse. It has accounted for probably more misery and suffering than any of the great plagues of history, including the great bubonic plague of Europe, tuberculosis, and syphilis. Its effects are certainly more devastating and widespread than any of these modern-day epidemics, which currently take up so much of the community's attention and resources. For instance, motor accidents, heart disease, and of course now AIDS. Yet, the public response to child sexual abuse, even now, is fragmented, poorly coordinated, and generally ill-informed. That's sobering stuff, isn't it? When we begin to get a perspective like that. Let's today talk not about abuse and the community at large, but let's just talk about abuse and its possible potential impact in the church. In the year of 2005, which starts to sound a while ago now, the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists released a statement in which they said Seventh-day Adventists seek to live by the highest moral and ethical principles and oppose all forms of sexual abuse and family violence. It's a church statement, actually putting a statement out there, making it very clear that we take very seriously responsibility to make the church and community a safe place for children. And to remain indifferent and unresponsive is to condone and perpetuate abusive behaviours. So we do need to take active steps. Our churches acknowledge that. And the things that we do in church settings is about being proactive. Being reactive means being too late. Let's just get a very clear message across. Sexuality of itself is a gift of God, and that we are created by God to experience intimacy and a longing for it as sexual beings. And we need to be very clear about that, that we are talking about a picture of God's creation that is part of His image, and that we should honour and respect and protect that element of our being. We are all sexual beings. And that a sexually intimate relationship can be an expression of a deep, intimate love when there is, as contributing factors, mutual and shared power, mutual choice, when there's a freedom of choice to do that in appropriate circumstances. And so sexual contact, however, can be used in inappropriate ways to exploit, violate, control, and dominate another person. And it's that use of sexuality that child sexual abuse and sexual abuse occurs in that arena. I will say some more about the power and sexual abuse later. And I would acknowledge that there are no doubt many of you here who know a great deal about this topic. I just happen to be the spokesperson today, but I acknowledge that many of you will also understand it. So let's think about safety and awareness. And this morning in service, I mentioned some of the elements that God emphasises in the Word, nurture and teaching in the Scripture. That's an image of safety, the wings, the feathers, the covering, the nurturing, the refuge type things. And God is pictured as a supportive, caring parent, as a shepherd, and all those things that we've talked about, the refuge, the fortress. And indeed, we know in Deuteronomy the model and the leading that the older people can give to the younger is about giving them a role model and a picture of how life can and should be. And what I would finally say is that you cannot give enough emphasis to the safety and honouring of children. It's a fascinating image, isn't it? Jesus sitting with a child. And all the crowds are looking on, disciples looking on, and he's saying these amazing things. That when you look at a child, that's what God looks like. this is what the kingdom of God is really like. So when children are assailed and assaulted, it's an assault on God's nature, God's being, God himself. So I just think that's a really powerful image. That Jesus says, don't restrain the children. Bring the children to me, because that's the best way that I can express how my kingdom looks. And then he said those really sobering words. If someone offends a child or is inappropriate toward a child, then I can't think of any more expressive language. I know it's metaphor that Jesus was using, but he said, a millstone. How much do we have to do with millstones today? Not so much. But I assume that if I were to say to you, a big solid hunk of concrete or the like, you'd get the message. And you take somebody who's offensive toward children and you take them out to the deepest part of Sydney Harbour and you toss them overboard with the concrete neatly secured with a good chain. Now that's expressive metaphor. I don't think the Lord asked us to do that. And if any of you are harbouring that thought, think again. But the concept is that offending against a child is a very serious issue. That's what the message is. And Jesus, who was not given to that kind of metaphor, when he uses it, it's intended that we sit up and take note. Okay, let's just think how some of the issues, the way that we have church life, and this is true across many churches, but I've noticed this has come, some of the elements of our own church we may like to think about. The way that we do church may contribute to the safety or non-safety of the next generations. Just think, we have a church setting that's primarily come from a heritage of male leadership, and that's male focus. And even today, if you were to look at our church structure, it's primarily male in its leadership. And that of itself, I'm not going to comment on, but what it can do, it is that it may actually cause an unhelpful and unhealthy dependence upon that kind of power structure. And it may create an unhealthy power dynamic. And let me assure you that I have heard many, many stories of power in the church held in positions of leadership by elders or whatever that is actually used in inappropriate ways so that people within the church become victims of the misuse of the power. Now, we also have taught, and I guess we feel appropriately so, that we should be respectful and obedient to the authority of the Word and the authority of church representatives and of parents and caregivers. And we understand that that's important. It's a respectful authority. However, to demand an unquestioning, unhealthy compliance toward all authority is not actually healthy, and it increases dispowerment. And it may mean that when that authoritative, powerful role is misused, that people and children feel that they cannot talk to it because of compliance, because of models of compliance, and because they simply are too powerless to speak to it. So we have to actually educate so that while we want respect for authority, that respect does not tolerate inappropriate behaviour. It can speak out, in other words. I wonder how often you hear sermons on sex. It's not going to happen, folks, so don't get your expectations up too often. I don't think I've ever heard one preached. I'm probably one of the few people that has actually talked about it from the pulpit in our church, so I'm fortunate to still be here alive. But what I do know is that if you trace the history of the Christian church, there has been an unhealthy model of sexuality through most of its time. It began in the early days when the church fathers were getting their forces together in the Western Roman Church. We have Augustine, who came from a profligate background in terms of sexuality, to the opposite extreme, spoke against women and sex as evils, and that they were introduced by the apple, and women introduced evil into the world, and it's assumed that was including sexuality, and that sexuality was only for bearing children, etc., etc., and etc. So we've had a very negative image from our Christian heritage. I would not say it's always been like that in every avenue, and certainly in the Reformation there were some much more much different pictures being painted, but even so, even Martin Luther, who came out as a Catholic priest and married, he still saw marriage as somehow a result of the fall rather than a good thing, as much as he enjoyed his wife and children, etc. And it was probably John Calvin, who was one of the first great Christian leaders in Western religion, who actually spoke as a deposit with positivity toward some of those issues. But we haven't got a good history there, basically. And basically we don't talk about it in our church settings, so people have to find out about sexuality from other sources, and they're not always good sources, not always helpful or balanced sources. Another issue that we need to keep as context to what we're talking today is that mental health issues are generally not discussed in church settings. So we talk about physical health, that's okay. We may even talk a little bit about emotional health, but mental health issues tend to be downplayed. We're uncomfortable with psychiatric disorder or someone who's suffering from some mental difficulty, etc., etc. And we don't usually talk about it. And even processes of anger, grief and fear, shame and guilt are not generally discussed in any length in church settings. And as a consequence to that, we aren't very comfortable when those who have been victims of sexual abuse or other forms of abuse begin to speak out about and the impact it's had, or they act out in ways that don't seem appropriate. We tend to shy away and not deal with those issues. So that's not always been helpful. And then we have a lot of the forgive and forget. Does anybody know where that passage of Scripture is, forgive and forget? Do you know which book it's in? Some of you are laughing and some of you are not. I've had people even volunteer books. I want to tell you which book it's in. It's in King Lear by William Shakespeare, not commonly known as a writer of Scripture. Forgive and forget. I don't know where Scripture actually implies or says that we should forgive and forget. Forgive it does, but to forget not necessarily so. And if it's meant to be an easy forgiveness and a moving on without proper forgiveness process, then it's not scriptural. And we tend to have had a history of, because we have been faithful to the word and to the law, that we have had quite a lot of emphasis around moral values and ethical codes and punishing those who do not follow them. And I have witnessed often some diatribes against the sinners in the congregations. And as a consequence, we have sometimes been not very helpful toward those who have suffered abuse and may be acting it out in ways that don't fulfill our expectations or our moral expectations. And instead of looking at what's causing the acting out behaviour, we are sometimes more inclined toward condemning the behaviours. And I think the church has grown a lot in that area in more recent years, fortunately. And the bottom line is that addressing these issues of sexual assault of children is a new phenomenon. In the middle 80s, even the professionals were talking in terms of, well, you know, 1 in a million maybe, it's just so rare. I mean, it's in the last 2 decades that we have seen huge information growth that we actually have begun to understand that children are sexually abused. We have seen a lot of information put out in the public domain through the media only in the last several decades. So the whole issue of it happening in churches is a new thought. And I, to be honest, as someone who is fairly networked with most of the churches in Australia in this area, it's the same across the board. Most of us who have church families and church connections have only had to come to grips with this notion more recently. Isn't that true? It's just something we didn't think of. Yeah, and I could tell you unbelievable, endless stories of Australian development where institutions have had kids in those institutions who've suffered horrific abuse. And when they have tried to speak out, they have been punished or silenced because of the obviously mythical information they're providing. It could never happen, has been, because we simply couldn't even imagine it happening. And teaching children to protect themselves, that simple little exercise we had in church this morning, for kids to begin to figure out who could they talk to if they don't feel safe. Simple little protective things like that are relatively new notions as well, and they're not taught readily in church or even church school. So again, these are areas that I guess the church is trying to come to grips with more recently. So what makes a church inherently vulnerable? What is it? Churches represent communities who value trust, and I think that's a virtue. The church family has an element of trust about it, and I think we need to be trusting. The difficulty is that we haven't discerned in the building of faith communities who should be trusted, and we haven't put a value upon trustworthiness. We've just had blanket trust. And so church communities generally haven't thought very much about abuse of that trust and don't have much in the way of factual information, and frequently, as a consequence, lacks the safeguards that you need to maintain trust. There's lots of kids in church communities. We love the kids of our church. That was wonderful today. We had lots of kids come up for story, and I'm told they weren't all here even. There's more of them out there. And I love to see the kids in church. You love to see the kids in church. You don't always love to hear the kids in church, but that comes with it. The point is that kids and church go together. They just go together like black and white, like a keyboard, if you like. And as a consequence, they're also vulnerable because they're in a community setting. And the other thing is that church communities are voluntary. Now, I'd just like to ask, any elders in our congregation this morning? Could I just, because Penrith's in a lovely location, probably all very upwardly mobile, what's the pay rate for an elder at Penrith at the moment? Right, so you're into three figures. Well, there you go. Yeah, okay. And I imagine the deacons who have more risk attached, they're guarding the great wealth of the church, they'd be on even penalty rates doing out-of-hours work, right? We're voluntary. We don't provide pay scales and we don't have strikes about rising our pay, etc. We're a voluntary organisation and we need lots of people to do the work. So when somebody comes along and says, look, I just love working with kids, I'm good with kids, we say, praise the Lord, He sent us this person. But we haven't in the past actually asked, is this a safe person? In fact, the other thing is that we all know each other. We think we know each other, and the bottom line is we don't know each other that well. We might see each other twice a week. Maybe 3 times a week, maybe once a week, maybe every second week. That's the person we see. We don't actually know about all the other bits. And the truth is that I've had to actually come to the point of understanding that because I know someone doesn't actually mean I really know them. And that's hard. We'd like to think we do. So in that voluntary involvement, we need to make sure that we can put measures in place that are universal and bring a much greater element of safety. So what are we talking about today? We're talking that child sexual abuse happens in all aspects of community. We know that. We know there are enough studies, enough experiences to know across any society child sexual abuse exists. And it's probably always existed. What happens in a wider community is also reflected in church communities. Social change, social order, relationship change happened in the wider society. It happens in the church. Okay? We're human. We're not immune from the greater impacts. And the effects of child abuse can be deep and long-lasting, and we need to acknowledge that. We look at that children do have some basic rights. In the past, rights have not been accorded to children. When I was a kid, and I read about kids working in factories 14, 16 hours a day, little slaves, I thought, that's wrong. Why is it wrong? Because children have some rights. Scripture actually reminds us that we should accord rights to children. They do have a right to feel safe and to be safe. And churches have a duty, a sacred trust, I believe, to safeguard children and provide safe, nurturing environments. And that there are helpful ways that communities and churches and church communities can respond to the occurrence of church abuse and be proactive to prevent it wherever possible happening. Practical things that we can do to reduce risk and abuse occurring within the congregation. You can't stop it entirely, but you can do a lot more than most churches do currently. So what are we talking about when we talk about child abuse? Any treatment of a child that threatens a child's well-being or safety, their physical or emotional health and or development, that's what we call abuse. And the abuse, it might be physical, might be emotional, might be sexual, might be spiritual. It can be inflicted by an adult or another older or more powerful child. That's what we call sexual abuse. Or child abuse, rather. And then, of course, one element of that is sexual abuse, is what we're talking about today specifically. We usually think of that broader definition of abuse, and there's lots of variations, and we tend to talk about abuse and neglect. But today, I'm specifically addressing child sexual abuse. It's any sexual act that's explicit, sexual behaviour or sexual threat imposed on a child or a young person by an older or more powerful person. Do you know, one of the amazing things that we're discovering now is that at least 30% of the sexual abuse that occurs is by older children upon younger children. It might be as high as 50%. And that's something we haven't really thought about. So when we now think about the way that we do our pathfinders, all our youth and children involved activities, we need to take that into account. That offenders of sexual abuse may be male or female, adult or an adolescent, or even an older child. And when the offender is a stranger to the child, which is in the minority of cases, when I was a kid it was always stranger danger. Look out for that man in a raincoat in the park or a greatcoat or something. But what we know now, that's probably only 10 to 20% of where most sexual abuse originates from. So when the offender is a stranger, the abuse tends to be much more severe, violent. It's those more like those kinds of abuse cases you read in the paper where a child's abducted and horrifically assaulted. But when it's within a trusting relationship, which is where most abuse occurs, it can begin when the child's very young and can go on for a long period of time. So usually that abuse begins with less contact, if any, and it progresses over more contact and frequently has elements in the environment of that contact of trickery, bribery, manipulation, threats, and sometimes force. And I need to say to you folks, the manipulation around child sexual assault is beyond belief. The manipulation of the wider environment, the parents, family, and the child. It is huge. And what we actually say is that sexual abuse is much more defined in terms of power than sex. It has sexual expression, but it's actually about the power of one person which is much greater over the power of another, which is much lesser. And how that differential is inappropriately administered. And so when someone exploits the dependence and the immaturity, the naivety and innocence of a child, then that's an exploit of power. exploitation of power. What we also need to notice, of course, is that sexual abuse in our country of Australia, in every state, and in most countries of the Pacific, if not all, is an abuse of power, but it's also a crime. So all the related activities around sexual abuse, the behaviours that set up a child and an environment, through to the physical violation of a child, all account for what we call sexual abuse. That's because a child cannot give consent to something they don't really understand. The law recognises that. The law says we have what we call an age of consent. And what the law is saying is that kids can't consent to adult thinking and stuff, or the behaviours of adult sexuality. And so we have the age of consent. So sexual abuse is physical or psychological coercion. And when you have peer behaviours, in other words, sexual play between children, that is different to this harmful abuse of power. So sometimes kids learn about their sexuality from some pretty sus sources. But quite commonly, more than parents ever know and would like to know, there goes on that, well, look, let's play doctors and nurses. Look, I'll show you mine and you show me yours. It's fairly quick, it's reasonably innocent, and kids give themselves an education. And it happens much more than the kids let on, I might add. They don't tell their parents everything. But because the church and other institutions of the past haven't provided good models and education, many of us learned it behind, well, dubious walls and doors and things, in secret spots and places. That's how much of the education occurs. So what we're actually saying back there is, oh, what have I done? We'll just go back to the... is that when kids are doing that peer consensual thing, that's not categorised as sexual abuse, but when an older child is imposing on a younger child behaviours and other activities that are inappropriate and harmful, that's sexual abuse. Now, here's just a few figures that I'll throw up for you just to give you a sense of. Griffith University last year found that of 45% of women between the age of 18 and 41 years had been sexually abused as children. The abusers were family members, about 30%, family friends, about 50%, strangers only accounted for about 14%. There's a little bit of difference between that and 100%. We don't know all that information, but what that's telling us that the greatest source of abuse was from family friends, much more than strangers, and of course incestuous behaviours as well. What it also found was that 75% of the abuse involved some contact. In other words, where it involved contact, most of it was quite severe. And what you would find is that over quite a period of time. 1996, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, the ABS, found that 1 in 4 females and 1 in 7 males report being sexually abused by the time they'd reached adulthood. Now, I need to say that those figures are reasonably universal. You will find most literature, the figures that come up from studies around Western world, about 1 in 3 or 4 females report being sexually abused, 1 in 7 to 10 males. That's a fairly consistent figure that is actually reported. And there may be a difference between reporting and what's not reported, but that's the reported kinds of figures. And we haven't really got any reason to think differently about that, what's now over 10 years ago study done. Self-reports by offenders recorded in 2 studies fascinated me, which I read more recently. Australian work professor, South Australian professor, found, looking at a couple of studies of offenders, one in a prison setting and one in a totally non-convicted setting, they found that when the truth was uncovered, the offenders tend to acknowledge only the offences that were known, maybe one or two. But when the bottom line came and they actually reported in as it really was, both the studies, the offenders reported 522 offences each in one study and 520 in the other. In other words, we're talking about a lot of offences by an offender. That's a lot of offences, isn't it? Now, it wouldn't necessarily be 520 and 522 victims per reporter. It's about offences. So those many offences against one child could occur. But I would imagine there's quite large numbers of children involved in those offences as well. Okay. In Queensland, and I was talking up in Queensland just a little while ago, I put in a few figures for them. 340 boys and 1,009 girls between up to 0 to 14 reported being sexually abused. That's the actual numbers. 499 of those victims were assaulted by a non-family member known to them. In other words, a family friend. And 220 of those victims were assaulted by a family member. And 94% of that abuse occurred in private dwellings. So it gives you a sense of, it's not the strangers, it's the people that know the family, that are part of the family, etc., that actually participate in this abuse. And another interesting find was that there are an estimated, and it's only estimated, about 14,000 hardcore pedophiles in Australia. Now, the word pedophile tends to evoke different meanings to different people. It's not always a useful term, but they're people who offend against children in more than against one case. And only 38% of those who were sexually assaulted reported it. And the reasons for not reporting, they said that they were either too young, or they wanted to protect the offender, it's someone they know or part of the family, or they were worried that if they did tell, they wouldn't be believed. And child intuition is pretty accurate. They probably wouldn't have been believed if statistics tell us anything. So just to give you a sense of, a group of 300 hardcore pedophiles in Queensland are estimated on the stats rates to abuse approximately 150 children in their lifetime. Now that's a lot of children, isn't it? You add them up, and that means you've got about 45,000 kids in Queensland who will be abused by those pedophiles. Now we're talking large numbers, aren't we? Yeah. So we're talking about a problem that afflicts society that's not to be easily dismissed. It's just not a small problem. It's a problem of some immensity. I think I've been there. In Australia, between 2002 and 2003, we had 198,000 notifications of child abuse and neglect. That means one report for every 25 children in Australia. So 1 in every 25 kids is actually notified as suffering from child abuse or neglect. That means there's a report every 2 minutes, of which one child is confirmed as harmed every 13 minutes. That means that for every notification, every 13 minutes, one's verified. It's large numbers, isn't it? That's abuse and neglect. What have we got here? When you boil it all down, the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare says one child in Australia every 2 minutes, every 2 hours rather, is a substantiated victim of child sexual assault. That's the immensity of the issue that we're discussing. Would it be likely that if that's the case that it would impact the church? Of course it would be. We're talking about a huge issue. So now I've given you a sense of the immensity of the issue. What about the church? What do we know in the Adventist church? We know very little. Very little indeed. Most churches of Australia have really no statistical analysis or gathering of information around sexual assault. In fact, when the Adventist study which is called the Value Genesis Young Adult Study, 18 to 26 or 28 or something year olds in Australia, was conducted by Brian Craig, a colleague. That information that was gathered at that time was used by many of the churches in Australia because they had none of their own. So we're not alone in this. It was found in the few questions that were posed there that 5.1% of Adventists, or males who attend Adventist churches, and 28.8% of females who were attending and participated in the study reported that they had been sexually abused. I don't know much information around that or the context for that, but they were the figures. And if you look at that, the 28.8% is pretty well a community, 1 in 3 or 4 females been sexually abused. In other words, it tracks fairly close to community figures. It's not different. The males is very low compared to community figures. Community figures say 1 in every 7 to 10 males reports being sexually abused. 5.1% is very low. You may be interested that anecdotally, I don't think that those figures really do reflect the reality. In our Safe Place service, we have a free phone, and if at any time you would like to know what that number is, I'm sure your child protection officer has already told you, but there is a magazine that we put out that includes the free phone number, and I've left this literature here for you at the end of the talk. We've actually had, if not more, male assaults reported to us by people ringing in than female, at least as many. So anecdotally, we don't experience what was reported there, and I think that's probably under-reporting. And there's lots of reasons to know why males, or to hypothesize and know why males under-report, but they tend not to report as much as females what we would label as sexual abuse for different reasons I won't go into. Anyway, that's all we really know. Now, the church in North America and in the States, the Adventist Church, has more information. And the information that we know from the North American church is that the rates of sexual abuse that are reported within the church are pretty well in parallel with the rates that are reported in the wider community. So what we can fairly safely assume is what's happening in the community, unfortunately, sadly, occurs to our children of the church for different reasons, maybe, or the same reasons. So what makes children vulnerable? Why aren't they safe? Children are fairly powerless. Now, some of you who are parents or remember being parents, others of us have sealed that off and are trying to recover. When our kids stamp that foot and stop breathing, you're not quite sure who's in control, but you think the kid's got the power. But that's fairly temporary. It passes, right? Basically, adults have the power. As parents, you determine the outcomes for your children. You basically show them what the world is like, how it works, who God is, what your belief systems are. You actually show them your understanding of the world. And you basically order and to a great degree create their world. Children are powerless compared to adult power. So uninformed children, we know, tend to trust all adults. Kids can't ascertain adult motivations when they're younger. They don't figure out adult thinking processes. They think fairly concretely. They don't, and so they tend to trust all adults unless they're taught appropriately. So young children are incapable of assessing, as I've said, motivation, and we tend to teach our kids, for obvious reasons, to obey adults. But if they're taught to obey all adults, they're actually left very vulnerable. And another element is that children are just naturally curious about their bodies. And so they like to know and do things that are perhaps not always less than embarrassing. But the bottom line is adults are naturally curious about their bodies as well. Ask Hollywood. See what sells most stuff out there, right? So sexuality is something that is a gift given to us, and it's a gift that reflects the character, the attributes of God, and it's a good gift, so why wouldn't it be a good thing to be curious about? However, when people take advantage of that natural curiosity and misuse it, that's what we call abuse, and that's why children are vulnerable, and that's why they are in their innocence or in their naivety, as much as they may know, they don't understand the greater dynamics. What are the dynamics of sexual abuse? And I'm happy to talk to you about any of these issues if I can just get the overview done, which takes a little while. That gives us a context to work from. The victims of sexual abuse can come from any age range, but we know it's from babyhood, infancy, right through to adolescence for children. And we know that large numbers of very young children are sexually assaulted, sadly. It mostly commences at a young age, more pre-puberty than post-puberty, i.e. in adolescence. The average onset was found by a gentleman called Bowlby in Australia to be about 8 years. And if the average of a sexual assault on a child is when they're about 8, you can appreciate how young many of the victims are to get an average of 8. And it may occur just the once or a few times, but for many it's repeated and over a long period of time, particularly if the child is in a context or in a dwelling or in a setting or an environment where there's long-term contact between the child and the offender. So obviously in private settings like homes, that's the case. Unusually one-off, usually ongoing, regular, over a period of time in an established time and place. It can happen anywhere, and some abusers say whenever they have opportunity, but frequently it happens not only in the child's home, but in a place familiar to the child. So putting homes aside, where else might that be? Familiar to the child, bigger family. When I first started in the ministry, I actually began as a young man in Nottingham in the Midlands of England. And I was a young Australian in a very different environment. We had a very interesting and vibrant congregation in one of our large churches. And I was really intrigued because there was a large West Indian population, and they would arrive in the morning and they brought their lunch and they brought their tea. And they wouldn't leave church till 10, 11, midnight if didn't lock the doors. And church was just like a big home, a big family. And for many of us who have long time history of faith, may remember that church was more like that than it is now, where people had more time and it was just like an extended family. So the church actually potentially is like a home, which is a wonderful thing, but if it's not a healthy, functional family, it can be highly abusive. So offences can occur any time that the child is accessible to the offender. And as I mentioned, about a third of them said, any chance I get. But it's more sophisticated for many than that. What are the dynamics of child sexual abuse? Well, some of the dynamics are the impacts on the child. What is the image? What is the picture? What is the message to the child that they receive from the offender of how the world works? Well, they see themselves as responsible, dirty, useless, bad, and they learn that affection and exploitation come with the same hand. And they find that they don't have boundaries, no rights to privacy, and no control over those issues. And so they learn to ignore their needs for others, hence the exploitation. And they learn that they're there to service others. So you can see why some victims of sexual assault have no boundaries or sexual boundaries as they grow older. They've never actually understood what boundaries are because they've always been transgressed for them. And they learn not to trust their own feelings and judgments and so become vulnerable to further abuse. And they see closeness as trust, most likely to end up in yet another betrayal. And so you can understand why when sexual abuse occurs, spiritual, emotional, and often physical symptoms are a consequence. So that is why it is such a devastating abuse. And who are the victims? Well, let me explain how it works. It's anyone, any child who is vulnerable. And what does that mean? There's a sexual abuser in the environment, makes them vulnerable, and there's an element of secrecy. And when you combine any child in an environment where there's opportunity for secrecy and there's a sexual abuser, then you can have a victim. It's as simple as that. It's not because the child is, has a characteristic of or a vulnerability alone to be abused. You need an abuser to do it. But abusers do like vulnerable kids, I might add. What is the effect of sexual abuse? Some 70% of psychiatric patients are known to have been sexually abused as children. 40 to 60% of women in care suffering depression, phobias, OCD and personality disorders have been victims of significant child sexual assault. And 70 to 80% of sexual abuse survivors report excessive drug and alcohol use. The impacts are huge. And young people who have experienced child sexual assault have a suicide rate 10 to 13 times higher than other young people, the national average. So you can appreciate this is a serious issue with serious effects. So who are the offenders? Well, there's no one description of any offender, but what we know is that over 90% of reported offenders are male, and given that most mechanisms of reporting are geared, toward male offenders, that's what we know. We do not know much about female offenders, but at least what we do know is that 85% of offenders are known to the children, something between 10 or more even figures, 10, 20% of offenders may not be, but approximately around that figure. They don't have a distinctive psychological profile. There's no screen you can read the digital readout offender. They're not sick, average intelligence, wide range of backgrounds, tend to be under the age of 35, generally heterosexual males, and most offenders begin their offending in adolescence. Okay? Why do they abuse? Who do they abuse, rather? Most offenders, I said, begin in adolescence, and they assault one child, usually more, and whilst they may report one offence, you can often assume, quite accurately, that there have been more offences. Young people, they may offend within their family, outside of their family, or both. Depends. And they may offend against adults, they may offend against children, young people, girls, boys, both. Depends. They deny the existence and extent of their behaviour and the significance of the abuse and harm that it does in the lives of the victims, and they also don't take responsibility for their abusive behaviour, and the likelihood of it continuing is very high, very high. As I said, you can't take an offender and say, with a definition like this, each one is different, each comes from a different place, but we have a cluster of characteristics that seems to fit many. So what are the dynamics? Usually it's a premeditated process that involves, as I've said, the misuse of power by an older or more powerful person. They build a good reputation in their community. They become dependable, helpful, or very frequently needed and wanted people. Not always, some are socially inept, but generally they become people who you learn to trust and need. And they're often very good at it. Very good at being helpful and working with kids and being supportive, and they're often of a good reputation. And they emotionally control and entrap the child, the young person, their siblings, the wider family, the community. And they use things like promises and bribes, special attention. They may divide loyalties between siblings by treating one with special gifts and prizes and presents and money, and the other siblings become very annoyed about it, so they separate that sibling by those kind of behaviours, and they actually put their attention and energy into that child. And they will escalate what is no touch or innocent touch to more invasive touch. And it helps sometimes for them in their offending, if they can create a very negative image around the child, because that makes the child more dependent upon them and more available to them. So they tell lies about kids. They do things to make kids look bad, so the kid's in trouble and needs them. And they create a reputation so that the parents depend on them to help keep their kid in order, etc., etc. So it gives them contact with the child. So they're isolated from carers and family, and they employ confidences and treats and secrets and lies and information, and sometimes force and threats, sometimes. But they often don't need to use force or even threats. And they can manipulate to a degree that's unimaginable. And a lack of knowledge and a sense of self-protection that's so absent in many young people for lots of obvious reasons is actually taken advantage of. And in those few cases, they may use violence or force, and I have come across some of that. But secrecy is the watchword, and they avoid responsibility and accountability, and their greatest fear is not that they're abusing a child, but that if they get caught, not that it'll hurt the child, but that they might get into trouble. And it's amazing how well they can control children. They can give them the look, what happens silently, the body language can be very controlling, so that if a child is in a room with other adults or carers and the offender's there, they can actually just keep that child under control just by their body cueing. So here's a cycle that's been mapped to show typically how an offender may actually operate, and it's a cycle that's been confirmed with many. They have pro-offending thinking. They fantasize and rehearse what they're going to do. This is really important to them, and they get a lot of reinforcement from this. They actually then they not only do all that fantasy stuff, they are actually targeting maybe by this time an individual child or children, and we call it grooming or manipulating the victim and their environment. And then they recruit the child through some of the mechanisms we've mentioned, including favoritism, trust, isolation. And desensitization is a process by which they get the child used to the company of themselves and the child alone and with activities. And then they well may begin a little bit of touch that's quite non-invasive, quite accept maybe an arm around the shoulder, pat on the arm, pat on the head, whatever. And over a period of time, they increase the intensity or the location of the touch till it's inappropriately invasive in the genital area or whatever, and they'll do that in such a way to test if the child tells or not. And if the child doesn't tell, they know that they've got a green light. If the child tells, they've got an out. No, that was an accident. We were resting, we were playing, my hand slipped. Mind you, I wouldn't mind $1 for every time I've heard that a hand slipped. Yeah, okay, so they can move out of that. And of course, they also operate from guilt and fear. The guilt is for what they have done, and the fear is for that they might get caught and even go to jail. And then that drives them in the cycle back to maintaining the cycle, the pro-offending thinking, the fantasy, the rehearsal, and the engaging of the practice. And saying to themselves, it's okay, it's not good if people know, and they encourage the child in that same non-disclosure frame of reference. You agreed to this is your fault, you started this, you did it, da-da-da-da-da. And one of the reinforcements of that cycle that we were very disappointed to discover in our work in church life is that an added dimension is, and Jesus loves this loving behaviour. Jesus wants you to do this, that incredible spiritual abuse and reinforcement, which is very confusing for a child, and then they see that God is somehow into this, and it's very hard for them. And this cycle can happen for an offender over a space of just a few minutes, or days, months, or even years. And I read of a gentleman who actually spent 10 years grooming an entire child-related organisation, became a very important director so that he could then have unlimited children to abuse. Very patiently did it over a period of time. So what do offenders say to those that they abuse if that's the case? Well, it's pretty simple. They make the abused one feel responsible. They bear the blame. And if you do tell, no one's going to believe you. And they actually are telling the truth, because when victims tell, they're frequently not believed. They tell and tell sometimes, or they're not understood. And if you do tell, I won't love you anymore. And remember, many offenders are close to the child in other relationships. They may be a parent, they may be an uncle, they may be a close friend, and their affection is important to the family and to the child. And that child doesn't want to lose the good stuff. They might hate this other stuff, this invasive stuff. They don't want to lose those good connections. So that's very hard for a child. And children believe very concretely things are told. You must be a really bad child to let this happen. So, a kid sits with that, they're disempowered, can't tell, because they know they'll get into trouble because they're such a bad person. And you'll be to blame. And if I get sent away, it'll be your fault, and everybody will blame you. To some degree, that's true. And everybody will be upset, it'll be your fault. And the family might all break up. Or one of the ones that so often he said, you'll be sent away. And what does a kid fear most? Being separated from those connections of close attachment. So that's very effective and very powerful. Okay, why don't kids tell? Well, most children or young people don't disclose at the time, and many never do. And the disclosure can be delayed for a long period of time, even if they do tell, and they're afraid that they won't get believed, or if they do tell, they'll get into trouble. And many of the covert messages when children do tell are, you caused a lot of trouble here by telling. And many of the children who do tell, many of them retract their telling because it's just too hard. They may not know it's wrong or of interest to others. And one of the things that we know is in school, often girls around 13, 14, doing the personal development, PDHPE in schools, as they begin to hear of human interaction and behaviours, they suddenly twig, oh, this doesn't happen to all the other kids. This is not okay. They haven't known anything else. They think that's what growing up's all about. Or they think others wouldn't be interested if they did tell. And they know it's bad to talk about sexual things, and that's one of the downers of not having a healthy view of sexuality and being able to talk about it in healthy and appropriate ways. The kids can't tell when bad sexuality is happening. And they can be very embarrassed. Why wouldn't they be? And they may fear that they've been labelled. In fact, most kids want to be like other kids. They fear being different. They want to be like their peers. So why would they tell and be made fun of or be different? Unfortunately, many of the other kids have been abused and aren't telling either. And they just simply might not have the skills, or they might tell their teddy bear and their pet rock and the dog or their friend, and it never goes any further. Fortunately, some friends tell their mums, and their mums get onto it. But what we know is the average child probably tells 7 or 8 times before they actually get heard. Or the way that they tell is not understood. Mummy, is it all right if he does funny things? Of course it's all right to do funny things. That's fun. It's good to be happy. Misunderstood completely what the funny means. So kids don't always use language, the language that tells easily. And so one of the things that we can do for protective behaviours for kids is to teach them to use appropriate language. And they can be very confused about it and try to protect themselves and the offender. And the closer the offender is to the family or the child, the least likely, or the less likely it is that disclosure will take place. Okay, this is exhausting, isn't it, folks? You're doing well. I just need to give you this overview. Secrecy eliminates accountability. And one of the things is that we need open, transparent church activities. When we can do things in an open, honest way, it's so much better. So one of the things now is that if any of you are out of work looking for a job, I've got the business for you. All over Australia, Adventist churches, just at this moment, as churches and other denominations, are all putting glass doors in their Sabbath school rooms and all their meeting rooms. Look, start making doors with glass in them, you'd make a fortune. Okay, we're beginning to realise it's not a good idea to shut a door and lock yourself away with children. Begin to realise that openness, and I see you've got lots of glass, and we're all learning things that we weren't aware of before. And of course, I've told you some of these things. Children can hide the signs of abuse, so secrecy continues. Kids want to be normal, and they want to appear normal, and they'll do anything to be normal. So they don't tell, they don't show. And they do tell lies, usually to protect the offender. Children, particularly under the age of 12, very, very rarely lie about sexual abuse. I think as we get into high school years, you may get manipulation by adolescents against, and occasionally, and I have to say it is occasionally, it's not near as often as the myths would have it, they may actually distort and lie about abuse more in adolescent years, but that is fairly rare and pretty easily picked usually, generally. But kids under 12, they don't lie about abuse because they'd get into so much trouble. Kids lie to get out of trouble, not into trouble. They generally, if they do tell fibs, it's about protecting the person that's abusing or wanting to appear normal. And they don't know how to describe what's happening, so they often don't tell, or they try to tell in their own little way, but it doesn't get... adults don't want to hear it sometimes because the implications of hearing it are so horrific. And what it would mean to disrupt the family, the community, the church, etc. They just don't want to hear it, or they threaten or punish for being told it. So families and communities often maintain the secrecy, and the shame goes on, the lack of knowledge, the denial, and to protect themselves, adults will sometimes not act. And they may do that consciously or unconsciously, or go into denial. So for some children, they don't have opportunity to say no to an abuser. They can't talk about sexual matters. And in some cultures, and I know some of you would here represent cultures, where you simply couldn't say the things I've said today in a public forum. It's taboo. And it may bring huge shame to the family culture and the network to acknowledge abuse. And yet abuse is very abundant in such cultures. And in some cultures, the police, for many of our Indigenous community, the police are the ultimate no-no. Why would you tell them after all I've done to us? So it's really, really hard for them to speak out. That's why the church needs to be a model of a safe place. So why do children tell? Well, finally, they might find a safe person. And it could be just in the moment that the teacher, or the Sabbath school teacher, or that lovely lady at church, or that nice man who lives next door, they just might come out with it in the moment because that seems the right moment or a safe place moment or whatever. And they may learn, as I've mentioned, in school or other programs about how human interaction should be, a good model, and they realise that theirs has been a bad model. Or the abuse might escalate so much they just have to do something before it overwhelms and destroys them. Or because of health reasons or pregnancy or sexual disease, that may actually cause it to surface. Or they just get to the point where they've had so much they've got to burst out of this awful cocoon of abuse. And quite frequently they won't tell for themselves, but they'll tell to protect a sibling. And one of the awful truths that often emerges is that a child will tell to protect their sibling the secret they've held so long that the abuser said, if you do anything or tell, I'll just simply abuse your younger sister. And so they've said nothing about their own abuse to keep their younger sister or brother safe, only to discover when they ultimately tell their younger siblings were also being abused consecutively and being told the same story. So you can appreciate how difficult it is for kids. And when they do tell, all sorts of things happen. All hell breaks loose. For victims, for parents, siblings, the wider family, authorities, schools, church leaders, the carers, and the person accused, it all comes out in one huge torrent of confusing and chaotic events. And so there are varied reactions and responses, and it's not unusual for kids to retract their story because they can't cope with all this trauma and dilemma all around them. And when a child discloses, everybody's asking themselves, how will this affect me? But be it conscious or unconsciously, with varying outcomes. So, friends, it's complicated. It's difficult. It's never simple. It's never easy, and there are no winners when it comes to child sexual abuse. So, frequently, there's a resistance to disclosure because kids know that if they tell, there'll be so much trouble that it's not worth it. They'll just live with what they live with. And their symptoms and their impacts can be discounted. Family members can be actively or covertly hostile or blaming, and the child can be discredited or defamed and threatened, and the offender will probably deny. It's the common rule is that the offender will deny, will minimise, will rationalise, and will promise whatever. And basically, it is really hard to intervene. So outside interventions for church communities seem so embarrassing. Churches have been always good at trying to protect the community. They want to save the outside community, knowing about anything that might be bad in their church because they want to win the outside community. So we tend to protect the church name. That's universal across all churches. And what I've discovered more recently, that for some of the large church organisations, the clergy have been basically raised in a culture that says protecting the church name at all costs is our first duty. So with a culture like that, it's very difficult for interventions to take place. But what I've discovered, it's very hard for a church to manage these issues without some form of outside intervention. They all know each other, and it's very hard to deal with people you know really well, to be firm with them, and disclosures are then disbelieved because we know he wouldn't do that anyway, etc., etc. So the outcome is often the story is retracted or it goes nowhere, unless we have good systems in place. So when a child discloses, we need to listen to their story, try and remain calm, because the kid's world's fallen apart. Don't fall apart in front of them, do it later. Try and give them a nice, safe, private place. Don't leave them alone. Let them know you believe them. It wasn't their fault. Adults sometimes do bad and dumb things, and you know of other kids that this has happened to. It's normalising it for them, that you don't need to judge the offender, but you need to tell kids they were right to tell, and that you're glad, you mightn't be glad, but you're glad for them that they told, and that you will do something. And you can't promise what you can't do. So don't promise them things you can't do. Don't ask those closed questions like, did he do this and did he do that? But just ask the open-ended questions till you have enough information to know that you need to disclose and do something about it. You can offer support, but you can't offer stuff that can't be delivered. And the truth is that some children disclose and they will have to go back to more abuse, and none of us can intervene on occasions. It's a terrible reality. So do promise what you can give, not what you can't give, because otherwise it's another betrayal for the child. Make sure you consult with others. Don't do this on your own. It's not a good idea. And don't become an investigator. That's not our job. If you have reasonable concerns, you need to notify somebody. And we've given you in the book phone numbers, and you've got a child protection officer in your own church. You can talk to your pastor, whatever. But you need to notify someone, and if it's known child sexual assault, it needs to go to the authorities. So there it is, folks. Here's a little model of how the church can think. We need to have a child protection kind of model in our heads. One that means kids are safe. We need to operate safe ministries, our Sabbath schools, our pathfinders, our worship. Everything needs to be done with the context of safe ministry. We need to provide a safe environment, and that means preventative practices where children are valued and heard. All those beautiful children in your congregation, let them feel like they've got a place in the church. Obviously they did this morning. That's fantastic. But let's honour kids. Let's listen to their voices and keep doing it. I just love to see it. Share the responsibilities so that the pastor, the board, the church leaders, the parents all have input into the safekeeping of children, that we provide safe environments, that vulnerable people, children, are safer. The kind of venues and activities that we operate aren't too risky. We need to be able to do risk assessments to figure out, is this a good activity for children or does it leave them at risk? So that then we have a safe environment. And that's fulfilling what we call a reasonable duty of care that we have to children and vulnerable people. So that's a bit of an overview, folks. I'll just leave this with you and then we'll have some questions. First of all, when we talk about these issues, they're a bit overwhelming, aren't they? They leave us feeling, oh, okay. And, you know, we tend to discount that which we can't manage. So we say something like, I don't think there's a problem here. And I can remember when I first started talking in this area, and those who started long before me tell me that, people say, what? Sexual abuse? Oh, you're kidding. It's the media, it's the feminists, it's the social workers, it's the psychologists. They invented this stuff. It's not true. Now, there are not too many people saying that today, although occasionally in a church I get a few irate saints who take me to task for even suggesting it in a church. Or else we say, well, we know the Catholics have got a problem. We all know that. Priests don't marry. Somehow the Pope's behind it. We know they've got a problem. And yet, the Church of England's been struggling a little bit because they had something to do with the Catholics in history. They sort of came from, so we know they've got problems, but then they're Anglicans. Well, maybe the Baptists, they're like us, but they might have an occasional problem, but certainly not the Adventists. No, never in the Adventist church. And then we reach the point and say, oh yeah, the Catholics, the Anglicans, the Baptists, and the Adventists. Well, that's a bit of a progression of thinking. And it works at a personal level too. I didn't see that happen. It wouldn't happen here. I couldn't make that judgment call. I mustn't have seen what I thought I saw. I must have misinterpreted. I don't believe this kid. I've seen this kid mucking up before. And, it can't do them any harm. It's happened to us. The kids should decide whether they tell or not. That's discounting. And that's how we protect ourselves. And it's actually a mechanism of self-protection. And we all go through it. Look, folks, I pick up the phone and I hear a story sometimes. I say, oh, dear, this is a nutter, this one. It's not ridiculous. Of course it didn't happen. Well, and all I'm doing is I'm protecting myself for a minute or two. I'm discounting. But really, as I listen to the story, I can't stay there, not for that person. And society does it too. They say, we all know children lie about abuse, get people into trouble. We all know that. Children, parents have got a right to bring up their kids like they like, and if that's the way they do it, kids are resilient. They'll get over it. They should be obedient. That's how society discounts it. But that's not acceptable, is it? We can't stay there. We might all do it, but we can't stay there. So we work through the significance thing. It's not a real serious problem. Maybe it happens a couple of times in the Baptist church, once in the Adventist church every year. Probably happens in the Northern Australia where they're all wild. Maybe in Queensland. Certainly wouldn't happen in New South Wales. Stuff. Okay, and it wasn't serious abuse. Look, maybe he touched her by accident. Maybe he shouldn't have done it, but look, let's not make a big deal of it. Etc., etc. And that's the way that we don't acknowledge, and we do it to protect ourselves, and it's understandable, and it's okay if we experience that, as long as we don't stay there, okay? We need to move on from that. We actually need to acknowledge that it's not only it occurs, it's a significant problem. It needs to be addressed. And we go through that helplessness thing like, nothing can be done, not my problem, leave it to the experts, let someone else do it. Church can't do anything, won't do anything, doesn't want to do anything. We haven't got the resources. Here at Penrith, it's hard enough just trying to pay the electricity bills, okay? The legal system, it's hopeless. Lawyers are all, and we just, we can't do this, okay? It's too hard, too big, too awful, and that's understandable. And sometimes we feel like that. And sometimes I'm hearing this story and I'm thinking, oh no, I think this person's right. I think it's a genuine story, but it can't be too bad. It can't be as bad as they say. And then I reach the point, yeah, I think this is true. I think this person's telling me how it is, but how can you solve it? And then I know who I could ring. I could ring someone else and make it their problem. And then I have to come to the point where I actually say, what can I do? What difference can I make? I may not be trained for this, but I can talk to people. I can talk to our child protection person. I can ring something. I know that there are things I can do, and I can get involved. And instead of saying it's not my responsibility, I can do something, and not just leave it to the experts. I might be a male, but it's good if males have a male model of protecting children. That's a good thing. I can actually get through these and become better than those kinds of self-talks that diminish what I can do. So ultimately, instead of saying, too hard, it's no good being a male, I can't do anything, or once a victim, always a victim. We come up with an action. So we acknowledge it exists, it's significant, it's solvable, and I can do something. That's what we need to do in our church settings, and that, folks, is how we begin to get a really good child-safe church. And that's what I work toward, a child-safe church. What's it look like? It welcomes, respects children and young people and their parents and their caregivers. It actually puts value on parents and kids, provides support, training and clear guidelines for staff and volunteers. Look, I know you do this one. I've got my spies out. I've heard you do that one. So that one's ticked. This is harder. I know you're working on that. Takes a bit more, and you've got to keep doing it. You've got to look out for risks, potential risks for children. Physical risks are easier. Like we had a nice luncheon today. Lovely soup, wasn't it? What a choice of soups. Never seen such a soupathon. Well, what about kitchens where we heat the soup up? Kids racing through there, past hot stoves, naked flames. Often churches don't think about that, but they can easily do a sort of a bit of a risk assessment check and figure out that's not a good idea. I love this. I have a favourite church in Sydney. They found a beauty when they did their risk assessment. Their youth department meets upstairs in the youth room, right? That's where youth should be, up there, out of trouble, can't hear them. Okay, now, there's a staircase to get there. Guess what the church stores under the staircase? They're gas bottles, as you do, right? Bit of a fire, up go the gas bottles. Will that youth group be high? I ask you. So they figured they better move the gas bottles. That's pretty easy. It's much harder to think about how can we keep our kids safe in terms of the issues I've talked about today. That takes a bit more thought, a little bit more thinking about, but you can do it. And we have risk assessment forms, and we're about to put a kit out for the conference to adopt that helps churches do that very thing. How to identify risks and actually anticipate so that they are reduced. And how do we get there? Okay, how to work continuously to prevent and reduce risks, keep our parents involved so they don't abdicate responsibility. Now that's a challenge. Isn't the church like a giant creche? Isn't that how it works? Parents drop their kids at the gate and come back and pick them up at the end of the day. That's like big camp, isn't it? Okay, but how can we do so that everybody is contributing to child safety? And how can we value and empower our children by listening to them, teaching them those kind of protective behaviours and understandings so that they're able to express anything that might be of risk to them? That's a challenge too, but we can do it. Churches are doing it, and we're developing resources to help them do it. How about a little rest? I think everybody should do a bit of a stretch, roll the neck, feel like I don't know if you ought to take some deep breaths with all this carbon dioxide around, but just do something so that, it's a bit excellent. We're moving. Somebody's moving out there. That's a good sign. Excellent. Any questions? Well, I've done most of what I needed to do to give that big overview, which is hard, but we've done that. I'm glad to talk and respond, and I may not have all the answers, but I'm glad to get a dialogue going.